The sun hung low over the jagged peaks of the Afghan mountains, casting long shadows that stretched across the barren landscape. Sergeant Mark Jensen leaned against the rough stone of an outcropping, his rifle cradled in his arms as he surveyed the valley below. The air was thick with dust and anticipation, and he could feel the weight of his gear pressing down on him. This deployment was unlike any other he had experienced in his 8 years of service, and it gnawed at him in a way that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. "Hey, Mark," called out Private First Class Danny Rodriguez, his voice laced with an unsettling mix of excitement and anxiety. "You think we'll see any action today?" Mark turned to look at Danny, his youthful face a stark contrast to the hardened veterans in their unit. "Action, maybe, but it's mostly quiet up here. We're in the middle of nowhere, and the locals are just trying to get by." He glanced back toward the valley. "But it's not the enemy I'm worried about. It's the mountains themselves." Danny frowned, confusion etched across his features. "What do you mean?" Mark hesitated, searching for the right words. He had heard the whispers among the troops, tales spun around the campfire at night. Stories of soldiers who had gone missing, inexplicable occurrences that could not be explained by the enemy or the harsh terrain. "I mean, it's easy to get lost in these mountains. There are places where no one goes, where people say, well, they say something evil lives here." Danny laughed, but there was an edge of nervousness in his tone. "Come on, man, you really believe that?" "Believe it or not, just keep your eyes open," Mark replied, his voice firm, "and stay close to the unit. We don't want anyone wandering off." Their squad was on a routine patrol, tasked with monitoring a remote village rumored to be a hub for insurgent activity. But as they descended further into the mountains, the air grew colder, and an oppressive silence enveloped them. The only sounds were the crunch of gravel underfoot and the occasional rustle of wind through the sparse vegetation. As night fell, they set up camp in a narrow valley. The sky was a tapestry of stars, but the mountains loomed ominously around them, creating a sense of isolation that felt almost claustrophobic. The fire crackled and flickered, its warm glow pushing back the encroaching darkness, but the shadows of the peaks stretched like monstrous fingers, ready to swallow them whole. "Let's keep the watch rotations short tonight," Mark ordered as the men gathered around the fire. "I don't want anyone falling asleep on watch." The others murmured their agreement, but Mark could see the unease in their eyes. The mountains were more than just a backdrop. They were alive with whispers of dread, and each soldier could feel it. As the hours passed, Mark settled into his thoughts, his gaze flickering between the fire and the towering peaks. Memories of previous deployments flooded his mind. Gunfire, chaos, the camaraderie of his brothers in arms. Yet, the memories were tinged with something darker here, something lurking just beyond the flickering light. "Anyone else hear that?" Danny's voice cut through the quiet, sharp and tense. Mark turned sharply, his instincts kicking in. "What do you mean?" Danny leaned closer to the fire, eyes wide. "I thought I heard, like a whispering. It was coming from over there." He gestured toward the shadows at the edge of the camp. "Probably just the wind," Mark said, though he felt a chill race down his spine. He had heard it too, a faint, almost imperceptible sound that seemed to ebb and flow with the wind, as if the mountains themselves were breathing. "Let's not get spooked," Mark said, forcing a chuckle to lighten the mood. "We're soldiers, not ghost hunters." But the laughter died in his throat when a distant howl echoed through the valley, chilling the blood in his veins. It was a sound unlike anything he had ever heard before, deep, mournful, and haunting. It seemed to reverberate off the cliffs, wrapping around them like a dark shroud. "Did you hear that?" Danny whispered, his voice barely audible. Mark nodded slowly, his heart racing. "Yeah, I did." The howling faded into the distance, but the tension in the air remained thick, suffocating. The soldiers exchanged nervous glances, their bravado slipping away like sand through their fingers. Mark glanced at his watch, 2:17 a.m. He cursed under his breath. It was going to be a long night. As the hours dragged on, each soldier took their turn on watch, but no one could shake the feeling of being watched. The mountains loomed closer with each passing moment, their jagged silhouettes becoming almost sentient in the darkness. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone, that something lurked just beyond the reach of the firelight. The sun began to rise, casting a pale light over the mountains, but the unease remained. They packed up their camp and resumed their patrol, the echoes of the night clinging to them like a ghost. Mark tried to shake off the dread, focusing instead on the mission ahead. As they hiked deeper into the mountains, the terrain grew rougher and the atmosphere shifted. The whispers that had plagued them the night before seemed to swell in the breeze, and every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig sent adrenaline coursing through their veins. "Sergeant," a voice called out. It was Corporal Trent, his face pale and drawn. "You need to see this." Mark approached, his heart racing. Trent stood at the edge of a narrow cliff, peering down into a rocky ravine. "What is it?" Mark asked, looking over Trent's shoulder. "Down there," Trent said, pointing with a shaking finger. "There's something strange." Mark looked down, and his stomach churned. At the base of the ravine lay a scattering of bones, some animal, some human. But what sent chills through his spine was the way they were arranged, as if someone had deliberately placed them in a circle. The earth around them was darkened and scorched, giving off an unsettling aura of decay. "Get the others," Mark ordered, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. "We need to document this." As they gathered around the gruesome scene, the air grew thick with apprehension. The men murmured among themselves, casting glances over their shoulders as if they expected to see something lurking just out of sight. "What the hell happened here?" Danny whispered, his eyes wide with fear. Mark knelt beside the bones, inspecting them closely. "I don't know, but we need to report this. It's not safe here." Suddenly, a loud crack echoed from the ridge above them, and Mark's head snapped up. The mountains seemed to groan in response, a deep rumble that reverberated through the ground beneath their feet. He instinctively raised his rifle, scanning the area for movement. "Did you hear that?" Danny asked, his voice trembling. Mark nodded, his heart pounding. "Everyone, get ready, stay alert." They quickly formed a perimeter, the shadows of the mountains closing in around them. The eerie silence enveloped them, broken only by the distant call of a raven. Then, without warning, a figure emerged from the trees on the opposite side of the ravine, a silhouette cloaked in darkness, its features obscured. "Is that a local?" Trent murmured, squinting to get a better look. Mark narrowed his eyes, his instincts screaming at him. "No, something's off. Stay back." The figure moved with unnatural speed, darting between the trees with an unsettling grace. Mark raised his rifle, heart racing, but the figure vanished as quickly as it had appeared. The men exchanged anxious glances, their breaths coming in shallow gasps. "Let's move, now," Mark shouted, urgency flooding his voice. As they turned to make their way back to camp, the howling returned, louder and more frantic than before. The mountains seemed to close in around them, the once familiar terrain transformed into a twisted labyrinth of shadows and whispers. They trudged onward, the feeling of dread growing heavier with each step. Something was watching them, something evil, lurking in the depths of the mountains, something that thrived on their fear. "Stay close," Mark barked, fear creeping into his voice as they made their way back through the narrow paths. But the sound of footsteps behind them quickened, echoing their own. They stumbled into the camp, hearts pounding in their chests. Mark's mind raced as he struggled to understand what they had encountered. But one thing was clear: the mountains were hiding secrets, and those secrets were not meant to be uncovered. As darkness fell once again, the men gathered around the fire, their eyes darting nervously into the shadows. They told themselves it was just fear, just the uncertainty of their mission, but deep down, they all knew the truth. The mountains were alive with something sinister, and it would not let them leave easily. "Do you think we'll make it out of here?" Danny whispered, breaking the oppressive silence. Mark met his gaze, the weight of his own fears reflected back at him. "We have to. We need to stay together, watch each other's backs." But as the fire crackled and the darkness pressed in, a terrible feeling settled over them, as if they were already marked as prey in a game played by something far more ancient and malevolent than they could ever understand. And in the mountains of Afghanistan, the evil watched, waited, and whispered its dark promises into the night. The dawn of a new day brought little comfort to the men huddled around the campfire. Mark's mind was a tumultuous storm of thoughts, the events of the previous night replaying in his mind like a broken record. What had they encountered? The figure, the bones, the whispers. Each piece of the puzzle seemed to lead only to more questions. "Let's pack up," Mark ordered, his voice steady despite the turmoil within. "We need to report our findings and regroup with the main unit." Danny nodded but looked hesitant. "You think they'll believe us?" "Doesn't matter if they believe us. We need to get out of this valley," Mark replied curtly, his eyes scanning the perimeter. The mountains loomed like ancient sentinels, watching, waiting. As they broke camp, the atmosphere was heavy with unspoken fears. The men worked silently, stealing glances at one another, sharing the weight of a shared trauma that bound them closer than any words could express. Each rustle of leaves or distant howl made their hearts race, an electric tension that felt like a noose tightening around their throats. "Hey, Mark," Trent said quietly as they packed up. "Do you think we should send a message back home about what we found?" Mark paused, considering the implications. "We will, but we need to get out of here first. We don't know what else is lurking in these mountains." Once everything was packed, they began their descent from the narrow valley, moving cautiously as if the very ground beneath them might swallow them whole. The path was steep and treacherous, a serpentine trail that wound through craggy rocks and dense underbrush. With every step, the oppressive feeling grew, as if they were being pulled deeper into the mountain's grasp. As they trekked, the shadows lengthened around them. The day slipped into an early dusk, and a thick fog began to roll in, obscuring their view and dampening the sounds of the world. The soldiers pushed on, but unease gnawed at their insides. "Mark," Danny whispered, his voice trembling. "I can't shake this feeling, like something is following us." "Focus," Mark replied, though he could feel the tension in his own gut. "We keep moving forward. Stay alert." But the whispers began to return, low and mournful, like a wailing ghost drifting on the fog. The wind carried their eerie timbre, twisting and curling around them. Mark could feel the hairs on his neck standing on end, an instinctive response to a threat he could not see. "Sergeant," Trent said, his voice strained. "Can we stop? Just for a moment?" Mark glanced at the men. They looked worn, fear etched into their faces. "All right, but just for a minute," he relented, scanning the area for any signs of danger. They found a small clearing and settled in, the men dropping their packs with relieved sighs. The fog clung to them like a shroud, and the silence felt almost oppressive, pressing down on them. Mark pulled out a map, trying to orient themselves. "Where do we go from here?" Danny asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Looks like we should head southwest," Mark replied, tracing their route with his finger. "That should lead us back toward the main road." Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed through the clearing, and all heads snapped up. The sound was followed by an unnatural rustling in the trees, a cacophony that sounded like laughter mixed with something darker. "Did you hear that?" Trent whispered, his voice trembling. "Everyone, grab your gear," Mark barked, his heart racing. "We need to move now." They scrambled to their feet, adrenaline coursing through their veins as they grabbed their weapons. The feeling of being hunted tightened around them like a vice. As they started to move, the whispering intensified, swirling around them like a storm. "It's like they're taunting us," Danny muttered, his eyes wide with terror. Mark kept his focus, pushing them forward, but the forest around them seemed to shift. Paths twisted, shadows lengthened, and the fog thickened, closing in around them. It felt as though the mountains themselves were reshaping the world, trapping them in an endless loop of despair. "Keep moving," Mark shouted, urging them forward, but their progress was slow. The fog was thickening, making it hard to see even a few feet ahead. Every rustle in the underbrush made them jump. Every distant echo seemed like a hunter stalking them through the haze. They pressed on, the whispers now rising into a chorus, filling the air with haunting cries. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he fought to maintain control. The men were starting to panic, their eyes darting around, scanning the shifting shadows for any sign of danger. "Look," Trent suddenly shouted, pointing ahead. Mark followed his gaze and felt his stomach drop. A dark figure stood at the edge of the clearing, shrouded in fog, its outline indistinct but unmistakably human. Mark felt a chill crawl up his spine. "Who's there?" Mark called out, voice firm despite his growing fear. The figure didn't move, just stood there, silent and still. But as the wind shifted, the whispers crescendoed, and Mark could hear them clearly now, words in a language he couldn't understand, woven with a sense of foreboding that made his skin crawl. "Mark," Danny hissed, his voice trembling. "We need to go, now." Mark felt the tug of fear, but he couldn't look away from the figure. "Stay together," he ordered, raising his rifle. "We don't know what we're dealing with." Suddenly, the figure turned, and Mark caught a glimpse of its face. A twisted visage, features distorted in the fog, eyes hollow and dark. It opened its mouth, and the whispers erupted into a deafening wail, a sound that seemed to rip through the very fabric of the air around them. "Run," Mark screamed, breaking the paralysis that had gripped him. They sprinted into the fog, hearts racing, the cacophony of whispers and howls following close behind. The path twisted and turned, disorienting them as they fled deeper into the mountains. Mark fought to keep his bearings, but every direction seemed to lead them further into chaos. "Keep moving," he shouted, pushing the men forward. But panic had set in. They stumbled over rocks, gasped for breath, and the darkness swallowed them whole. As they ran, Mark felt a surge of desperation, an instinct to survive. The whispers morphed into something sinister, a mocking laughter echoing through the fog. The men fell behind, their voices fading into the distance as the weight of the mountains bore down on them. "Mark," Danny's voice cried out, but it was lost to the fog. He turned, trying to catch a glimpse of his comrades, but the shadows danced around him, concealing them in a shroud of darkness. Mark fought against the tide of despair that threatened to engulf him. "Danny," he called, panic creeping into his voice. "Trent." But the only response was the relentless laughter, a chilling sound that clawed at his sanity. Alone in the suffocating fog, Mark's heart raced as he pressed forward, the weight of the mountains pressing down upon him. He stumbled into a clearing, breathless and terrified, but the fog was lifting, and in its place stood a sheer cliff face, towering above him. Mark's heart sank as he realized he had reached a dead end. "Mark." The voice was distant, fading. He turned back toward the path, but it was lost in the swirling fog. The whispers returned, sharper now, like claws scraping against his mind. "Join us, join us, join us." "No," he shouted, clenching his fists in defiance. "I won't." But the fog thickened, curling around him like a serpent. The ground beneath his feet trembled, and the whispers crescendoed into a frenzied roar. Shadows danced at the edges of his vision, swirling and twisting, and he stumbled back against the cliff face, heart racing. In that moment, he felt the presence, the thing that lurked within the mountains, watching, waiting. Mark closed his eyes, trying to shut out the terror, but the whispers turned into a haunting melody echoing through the depths of his mind. "Join us, join us." With a final surge of adrenaline, Mark pushed off the cliff face and sprinted back into the fog. He had to find his unit, to warn them of the evil that haunted these mountains. But as he ran, he felt the weight of despair settle over him. The mountains were alive with a darkness that twisted reality, and no matter how fast he ran, it would always be right behind him. Mark sprinted through the fog, every instinct urging him to escape the clutches of whatever malevolence was hunting him. He pushed through the dense underbrush, gasping for breath as the whispers seemed to claw at his mind, each syllable like a cold finger tracing down his spine. "Mark, Mark." He halted, the sound of Danny's voice cutting through the haze. Hope surged within him, and he turned sharply in the direction of the sound. "Danny," he shouted, his voice hoarse. "Where are you?" "Over here." Danny's voice came again, closer this time, filled with panic. Mark dashed toward it, adrenaline propelling him forward through the choking fog. As he emerged into a small clearing, the mist lifted momentarily, and he spotted Danny crouched against a tree, wide-eyed and trembling. Relief washed over Mark, but it was quickly replaced by dread as he noticed the shadows flickering at the edges of the clearing. "Did you find the others?" Danny asked, fear palpable in his voice. Mark shook his head, glancing around. "No, we need to keep moving. We can't stay here." "Where's Trent?" Danny asked, eyes darting nervously. "I don't know. We'll look for him on the way. Right now, we need to get out of the fog," Mark urged, already turning back toward the path. Just as they began to move, a sudden rustle broke the stillness, and Mark froze. The sound came from the direction they had just left. It was a low growl, reverberating through the trees, primal and threatening. "What was that?" Danny whispered, terror etched on his face. I don't know, Mark replied, scanning the surroundings. But we need to. Before he could finish, the growl escalated into a chilling roar, echoing off the cliffs surrounding them. Mark's heart raced as he caught a glimpse of movement in the shadows, a hulking silhouette, its shape grotesque and unnatural, emerging from the darkness. Run, Mark shouted, grabbing Danny's arm, and they bolted in the opposite direction. The creature pursued them, its footsteps heavy and thunderous, shaking the ground beneath their feet. They could hear the raspy breathing, each exhale laced with malice. They dashed into the trees, branches clawing at their faces as they sprinted, desperately trying to navigate the maze of trunks and shadows. The fog thickened again, obscuring their vision, but Mark pushed through the panic. They had to find the others and regroup. Keep moving, Mark yelled, urging Danny forward as they broke through the trees into another clearing. The fog swirled around them, but this time, they were not alone. Trent stumbled into view from the opposite direction, wild-eyed and panting. Mark, Danny, he rushed toward them, relief washing over his features. Thank God, I thought I was... Trent, behind you, Mark shouted, pointing back into the mist as the creature emerged, its form now clearly visible, a massive, hulking figure covered in matted fur and dripping with a viscous substance. It had eyes that glowed with an otherworldly light, reflecting a hunger that sent chills down their spines. The creature lunged, and they instinctively scattered, darting in different directions. Mark's heart raced as he ran, branches snapping underfoot, adrenaline surging through him. He could hear the creature crashing through the underbrush behind them, the growls echoing in the stillness. Mark, over here, Danny's voice called from the left. Mark turned, desperate to regroup, but as he ran toward Danny, the world around him shifted again. The fog thickened, swirling like a living entity, and the shadows lengthened, distorting his sense of direction. He lost sight of Danny, panic clawing at him as he called out, "Danny, where are you?" Silence enveloped him, suffocating and heavy. He stood still for a moment, catching his breath, listening for any sign of his friends. All he heard was the distant echo of the creature's growls, now mixed with a cacophony of whispers that seemed to seep from the very ground. "Mark," a voice called, soft and haunting. He whipped around, heart pounding. "Danny, is that you?" But the voice was not Danny's. It was deeper, rasping, and filled with an ancient malice. "Join us, join us." "Get back," Mark shouted, backing away. "I won't." Suddenly, the fog parted, and he found himself at the edge of a steep cliff. Below, the ground fell away into a dark abyss, the sound of rushing water echoing up from the depths. He teetered on the edge, fear clawing at him as the whispers intensified, rising to a crescendo that filled his ears. "Join us," the voice hissed again, and Mark felt a cold presence wash over him, a wave of despair that threatened to pull him into the darkness. "No," he screamed, shaking his head violently. "Get away from me." In that moment, the figure lunged from the fog, long, clawed hands reaching out toward him. Mark stumbled back, adrenaline coursing through his veins as he turned and ran, the edge of the cliff behind him a reminder of how close he was to losing everything. He dashed into the trees, ignoring the stinging branches that whipped at his face. He had to find Danny and Trent, had to regroup. Panic bubbled inside him, pushing him forward even as the darkness pressed against him, whispering promises of despair. Finally, he broke through the fog into another clearing. "Danny, Trent," he shouted, voice hoarse. "Mark." Danny's voice came from nearby, and he turned, relief flooding through him as he saw his friend crouched against a tree, trembling. "Thank God," Mark gasped, rushing toward him. "Where's Trent?" "I don't know," Danny replied, his eyes wide with fear. "I thought he was right behind me." Mark glanced around, the fog swirling ominously. "We need to find him. We can't leave anyone behind." But just as he turned to move, a sound echoed through the trees, a chilling cry that sent a jolt of fear down his spine. "Trent," he shouted, fear creeping into his voice. "Mark, we need to go. Now," Danny urged, grabbing his arm. Mark hesitated, glancing back toward the sound. "We can't leave him. We can't help him if we're dead," Danny shouted, desperation spilling over. Reluctantly, Mark nodded. "Okay, but we need to keep moving." They turned to run, but the whispers were all around them now, enveloping them like a fog of despair. Join us, they called, a haunting melody that twisted through the trees, beckoning them into the darkness. They plunged deeper into the forest, hearts pounding in unison as they navigated the twisted paths, the fear of the unknown driving them forward. Mark's thoughts raced, and he could feel the shadows closing in, the weight of the mountains pressing down on them. Which way? Danny gasped, glancing over his shoulder. I don't know, Mark admitted, frustration rising within him. We just need to keep moving. The forest around them twisted and turned, disorienting and treacherous. The fog thickened, and the shadows lengthened, creating a labyrinth that felt alive with malicious intent. Mark felt the oppressive presence growing stronger, an unseen force watching their every move. We need to get higher, he said suddenly, his voice steadying with determination. If we can get to a vantage point, maybe we can see the way out. Are you sure? Danny asked, glancing nervously at the shadows. We don't have any other choice, Mark replied, pushing ahead. Follow me. They pressed on, climbing the uneven terrain, the fog clinging to them like a shroud. The whispers swirled around them, filling the air with dread. The growls echoed in the distance, a constant reminder of the danger lurking just beyond their sight. As they climbed, the path became steeper, rocks crumbling beneath their feet. Mark's legs burned, but he pressed on, determination driving him forward. They reached a ledge and he pulled himself up, taking a moment to catch his breath. Up here, he called to Danny, who was climbing behind him. As Danny joined him on the ledge, Mark peered over the edge into the abyss below. The fog swirled in the valley, obscuring everything, but he could hear the distant rush of water, a reminder of the world beyond the mountains. We can't stop here, Danny panted, glancing nervously at the shadows below. What if that thing finds us? We'll keep going, Mark assured him, steeling himself just a little further. As they climbed higher, the darkness pressed in around them. The whispers transformed into a cacophony of voices, rising in a crescendo that echoed through the mountains. Mark's heart raced, and he could feel the fear clawing at him, but he fought against it. Keep going, he urged Danny, pulling him along the narrow path that wound higher into the mountains. We have to get out of here. Suddenly, a scream pierced the air, echoing through the mountains, a chilling sound that made Mark's blood run cold. Trent, he shouted, the fear gripping his heart. Mark, we need to get out of here, Danny cried, panic rising in his voice. Trent, Mark called again, desperation spilling over, but the only response was the echo of the mountains, mocking him. They pressed on, the path narrowing as they ascended. The fog thickened again, wrapping around them like a vice, but they continued upward, the distant cries of their comrade driving them forward. Look, Danny shouted suddenly, pointing ahead. Mark squinted through the fog and spotted a dim light flickering in the distance. A fire, he asked, hope igniting within him. It could be another unit. Or it could be a trap, Danny replied, skepticism lacing his words. We need to be careful. Caution is the last thing we need right now, Mark insisted, determination coursing through him. We have to find out. They approached the flickering light cautiously, the whispers swirling around them, rising to a fevered pitch as they drew closer. Mark's heart raced as they broke through the fog into a small clearing, and there it was, a fire burning in the center, its light casting eerie shadows against the trees. Hello, Mark called, stepping into the clearing. Is anyone here? The fire crackled, and for a moment, there was silence. Then, a figure stepped from the shadows, a soldier, his face pale and eyes wide with fear. Who are you? Mark demanded, feeling a mix of relief and confusion. Get away from the fire, the soldier shouted, panic in his voice. It's not safe. What do you mean? Danny asked, glancing at Mark. What's happening here? The mountains, the soldier said, his voice trembling. They're alive. You can't trust anything, not even the fire. What do you mean? Mark pressed, his heart racing. We need to get out of here. Don't you see? They're watching us, the soldier whispered, looking over his shoulder. They're always watching. Mark felt a chill creep down his spine. What did you see? Voices, faces in the shadows. They'll take you if you're not careful, the soldier said, eyes wide with terror. Where's your unit? Danny asked, looking around. They're gone, the soldier replied, shaking his head. One by one, they disappeared into the fog. I'm the last one left. No, Mark whispered, realization dawning. We can't let that happen to us. We have to find Trent. The soldier's face twisted in fear. You don't understand. It's already too late. They'll take you too, just like they took him. Mark's heart sank as he felt the darkness closing in, the whispers rising in a cacophony. The soldier's words twisted in his mind, filling him with dread. Come on, we have to go, Mark said, pulling Danny away from the fire. But as they turned to leave, the whispers intensified, swirling around them like a storm. Join us, they called, their voices echoing through the clearing. Mark pushed forward, pulling Danny along, but the ground beneath them shifted, and the shadows lengthened, blocking their path. The fire crackled, and the soldier's figure flickered like a mirage. Mark, Danny shouted, panic rising in his voice. Suddenly, the figure lunged at them, arms outstretched, but as it reached for Mark, it dissolved into shadows, leaving nothing but the fire flickering in the darkness. The whispers grew louder, filling the air with a suffocating darkness. Keep moving, Mark urged, panic clawing at his throat as they stumbled back into the fog. They had to escape, had to find Trent and get out of the mountains before it was too late. But the fog closed in around them, and the whispers swirled like a tempest, taunting them, beckoning them deeper into the abyss. Mark, Danny cried out, fear etched on his face. Where do we go? Just keep moving, Mark shouted, determination driving him forward. They pushed through the darkness, the fog clinging to them like a shroud. But as they ran, the ground shifted beneath their feet, and they found themselves back at the cliff's edge, the abyss yawning before them. The shadows danced at the edges, whispering their promises of despair. Mark, Danny shouted, panic rising. We're trapped. No, Mark growled, forcing himself to think. They couldn't give in to the fear. We need to find a way down. There has to be another path. As they turned to search for a way out, the whispers grew louder, surrounding them in a cacophony of voices. Join us, join us. Mark gritted his teeth, pushing back against the despair that threatened to engulf him. We're not going to die here, he shouted, fighting against the darkness. But the shadows closed in, and the growl of the creature echoed through the mountains, a chilling reminder of the evil that lurked within the fog. The darkness pressed down on them, suffocating, as they fought to find a way out of the nightmare. And somewhere in the depths of the mountains, something watched, waiting for the right moment to strike, ready to claim its next victims. Mark and Danny stumbled back from the cliff, their hearts pounding as the dark presence loomed closer, its malevolence seeping into their minds. Desperation coursed through Mark's veins as he scanned their surroundings, searching for any semblance of hope. There has to be another way, he muttered, pushing through the fog. We can't stay here. We need to keep moving. Mark, Danny's voice trembled as he pointed into the shadows. Look. Emerging from the fog was a narrow path, winding down the side of the cliff, barely visible amidst the dense undergrowth. It was steep and treacherous, but it was their only option. Let's go, Mark shouted, grabbing Danny's arm and leading him toward the path. They descended quickly, their feet slipping on the loose rocks as they carefully navigated the perilous descent. The whispers echoed around them, relentless and insistent, weaving through the trees like a malevolent wind. Mark pushed the fear down, forcing himself to focus on the path ahead. They had to get off this mountain. As they reached the base of the cliff, the path opened up into a small valley, the fog swirling like a living entity around them. It felt as if the mountains themselves were closing in, their dark secrets threatening to consume them whole. Where do we go now? Danny asked, glancing nervously at the encroaching shadows. Stay close, Mark replied, scanning the perimeter. We need to find shelter and figure out a plan. They moved cautiously through the valley, the trees looming overhead like ancient guardians, their branches twisted and gnarled. The whispers grew louder, swirling around them almost as if the mountains were alive, breathing and watching. Suddenly, a rustling in the underbrush drew their attention. Mark froze, raising his rifle as they turned toward the sound. The shadows shifted, and a figure stumbled into the clearing. Trent. Mark, Danny, he gasped, relief washing over his features. I thought I'd lost you guys. Trent, Mark exclaimed, rushing to his side. What happened? We thought you were gone. I got separated, Trent replied, his face pale and eyes wide with fear. I heard the whispers and ran. I didn't know where I was going. I thought I'd never find you. Stay close, Mark said, glancing back toward the forest. We need to find a way out of here before that thing finds us. Did you see it? Trent asked, trembling. Mark nodded grimly. It's still out there, lurking in the shadows. We can't let it corner us again. Then we need to get moving, Trent said, determination seeping back into his voice. Where do we go? Mark glanced at the mountains towering above them, the fog swirling ominously. We head for that ridge, he said, pointing toward a distant outcrop. It'll give us a vantage point. They started moving again, the three of them huddled close, weapons drawn and hearts racing. The whispers persisted, wrapping around them like a sinister embrace, growing louder and more insistent with each step. Mark, Danny whispered, fear lacing his voice. What if we can't escape? What if we're trapped here forever? Mark clenched his jaw, pushing back the creeping despair. We will escape. We just have to keep moving forward. As they trekked through the valley, the shadows shifted and danced around them, the fog thickening again. Mark felt a sense of foreboding, as if the mountains themselves were shifting, reshaping to trap them. Keep an eye out for anything, Mark warned, his senses on high alert. We need to stay together. But as they climbed higher, the landscape around them began to change. The trees grew sparse, replaced by jagged rocks and steep cliffs, the fog swirling ominously above. Where are we? Trent asked, panting as they reached a rocky outcrop. This isn't where we came from. I don't know, Mark admitted, glancing around. But we have to keep moving. They pressed on, but the path grew treacherous, the rocks crumbling beneath their feet. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices that echoed through the air, wrapping around them like chains. Mark, we're losing our way, Danny shouted, panic rising in his voice. Just hold on, Mark urged, pushing forward as the darkness threatened to engulf them. They had to keep moving, had to find a way out before it was too late. Suddenly, a deafening roar erupted from the shadows, echoing through the mountains. The ground shook beneath their feet, and they stumbled, barely keeping their balance. Run, Mark shouted, adrenaline surging as they turned and fled down the rocky path, the sound of the creature's growl echoing behind them. They could feel its presence, a dark shadow lurking just beyond their sight. They ran through the fog, the darkness closing in, each breath filled with panic as they desperately sought escape. The whispers swirled around them, mocking and taunting, growing louder with every step. Mark, Danny shouted, glancing back. It's coming. Keep going, Mark urged, pushing forward as the shadows danced around them. They burst into another clearing, and Mark stumbled to a halt, breathless. The fog hung heavy, and the whispers surrounded them, filling the air with despair. In the center of the clearing stood an ancient stone altar, worn and weathered by time, shrouded in darkness. What is this place? Trent asked, eyes wide as he took in the eerie sight. I don't know, Mark replied, feeling an inexplicable pull toward the altar, but we have to find out. As they approached, the whispers intensified, swirling around them like a storm. The shadows flickered, revealing strange carvings etched into the stone, a language long forgotten, its meaning lost to time. This is wrong, Danny stammered, backing away. We shouldn't be here. Mark felt a chill run down his spine, but something compelled him forward. We need to understand what we're dealing with. Suddenly, the ground shook again, and the creature's growl echoed through the clearing, growing louder as it drew closer. It knows we're here, Trent shouted, panic seeping into his voice. Look, Danny pointed at the altar. There's something. Before he could finish, the shadows coalesced into a dark figure, looming over the altar. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent light, reflecting the darkness that surrounded them. Join us, it hissed, the voice echoing through the clearing. Mark's heart raced as he stepped back, fear gripping him. What do you want from us? The creature leaned closer, its form shifting and distorting, a grotesque amalgamation of shadows and nightmares. You seek answers, you seek escape, but the mountains have claimed you. No, Mark shouted, shaking his head. We won't be part of this. But the creature only laughed, a sound that echoed through the trees, chilling Mark to his core. You are already lost. You cannot escape what you are. The shadows surged around them, swirling like a tempest, as the whispers grew louder, drowning out their cries. Join us. Join us. Run, Mark yelled, grabbing Danny and Trent as they turned to flee. They sprinted through the clearing, the darkness nipping at their heels. But as they reached the edge of the clearing, the ground fell away, plunging into an abyss. The darkness loomed below, a chasm that seemed to stretch on forever. "Mark," Danny shouted, fear evident in his voice. "What do we do?" "We jump," Mark replied, adrenaline surging. "It's our only chance." "No," Trent protested, panic rising in his voice. "We can't." "We have to," Mark urged, glancing back at the creature which was closing in, shadows swirling around it. "Now." They jumped, plunging into the darkness as the whispers reached a fevered pitch, echoing around them. Mark felt the wind rush past him, the abyss swallowing them whole as they fell into the unknown. The fall felt eternal, a descent into darkness that twisted Mark's stomach with fear. He could hear Danny and Trent screaming, their voices fading as they tumbled through the void. Panic surged through him, but he pushed it down, focusing on surviving. Suddenly, he felt a sharp jolt as he hit the ground, pain radiating through his body. Gasping for breath, he rolled to the side, instinctively reaching for his rifle. The darkness enveloped him, thick and suffocating, the fog wrapping around him like a shroud. "Danny, Trent," he called out, voice hoarse as he struggled to his feet. "Mark." Danny's voice came from nearby, filled with relief. "Are you okay?" Mark shouted, scrambling toward him. "I think so," Danny replied, emerging from the shadows, breathless and disoriented. "Where's Trent?" Mark glanced around, heart racing. "I don't know." "Trent?" he shouted, fear creeping back into his voice. "Over here," Trent's voice called from the darkness, and Mark rushed toward it, relief flooding through him as he found Trent sprawled on the ground, disoriented but alive. "Thank God," Mark said, helping him to his feet. "We have to keep moving. We can't stay here." As they regrouped, the darkness around them pulsed, the whispers rising once more, swirling through the air like a living entity. "Join us, join us." Mark clenched his fists, fighting against the rising tide of fear. "We need to get out of this place." They moved cautiously through the dark, the fog swirling around them. Mark felt the weight of the mountains pressing down on him, a reminder of the evil that lurked within. Suddenly, a flicker of light appeared ahead, cutting through the darkness. Mark squinted, his heart racing as they approached. The light grew brighter, revealing a cavernous entrance illuminated by an otherworldly glow. "What is this?" Trent asked, awestruck. "I don't know," Mark replied, feeling an inexplicable pull toward the light. "But we need to find out." They entered the cavern, the light enveloping them in a warm glow. The walls were covered in strange symbols, pulsating with energy, casting eerie shadows that danced around them. "This is incredible," Danny whispered, his voice filled with awe. But as they stepped deeper into the cavern, the whispers intensified, rising to a deafening roar. "Join us, join us." Mark's heart raced as he turned to the others. "We have to focus. We can't let the darkness consume us." Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows, a ghostly apparition with hollow eyes that glowed with a malevolent light. "You seek answers," it whispered, its voice echoing through the cavern. "Who are you?" Mark demanded, fear and anger surging within him. "What do you want?" "I am a guardian of the mountain," the figure replied, its voice filled with sorrow. "You trespass in a realm of darkness. You must choose, join us or be consumed by the shadows." "No," Mark shouted, shaking his head. "We won't be part of this." The figure's expression twisted into a grin, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. "The mountains claim all who enter. You cannot escape your fate." "Mark," Danny shouted, panic rising in his voice. "What do we do?" "Fight back," Mark shouted, raising his rifle. "We can't let it take us." The figure lunged forward, shadows swirling around it as it reached for Mark. He pulled the trigger, the sound echoing through the cavern, but the figure dissipated into smoke, reforming behind him. "Join us," it hissed, the whispers rising to a fevered pitch. Mark felt a wave of despair wash over him, threatening to engulf him. "No," he screamed, pushing back against the darkness. "We won't join you." "Your will is weak," the figure taunted, its voice dripping with malice. "You will be consumed." But as the shadows closed in, Mark felt a surge of determination. "We will not be part of this," he shouted, rallying his friends. "We have to fight." Danny and Trent nodded, fear replaced by resolve as they raised their weapons. Together, they advanced toward the figure, ready to confront the darkness. "Fight with me," Mark shouted, and they surged forward, determination coursing through their veins. But as they attacked, the figure laughed, the sound echoing through the cavern. "You cannot escape what you are." Suddenly, the ground beneath them shook and the cavern walls began to tremble. "Get back," Mark shouted, grabbing Danny and Trent as they retreated. But the shadows surged forward, twisting and writhing, blocking their path. Join us," the whispers echoed, filling the air with despair. "Mark," Danny shouted, panic rising. "What do we do?" "We have to find a way out," Mark yelled, desperation clawing at him. They turned, scrambling through the shadows, the figure's laughter echoing behind them. They raced through the cavern, the whispers swirling around them like a storm. Mark's heart raced as they navigated the twisting paths, searching for an escape. Suddenly, they burst into another clearing, and Mark stumbled to a halt. In the center stood a massive stone door, covered in ancient symbols and pulsating with energy. "This is it," he shouted, hope igniting within him. "This must be the way out." "Mark, it's not safe," Danny protested, glancing back at the shadows closing in. "Just trust me," Mark shouted, rushing toward the door. He could feel the darkness pressing in, the whispers rising to a crescendo. "Help me push." Together, they pushed against the door, feeling the energy pulsating beneath their hands. The stone groaned in response, but it held firm. "Come on," Mark urged, determination surging within him. "We can do this." But the whispers grew louder, drowning out their voices. Join us," they echoed, filling the air with despair. "Mark," Danny shouted, fear creeping into his voice. "We can't hold it back much longer." "Keep pushing," Mark yelled, gritting his teeth as he pushed harder against the door, but it wouldn't budge. Suddenly, the shadows lunged forward, surging toward them with a malevolent force. "You cannot escape," the figure hissed, its voice echoing through the cavern. Mark's heart raced as he felt the darkness closing in. "We can't give up," he shouted, pouring all his strength into the door. With one final push, the door began to crack open, a blinding light spilling through the gap. "We're almost there," Mark cried, relief flooding through him. But the shadows surged forward, wrapping around them like chains, pulling them back into the darkness. Join us," the whispers called, filling the air with despair. "No," Mark shouted, fighting against the pull. "We won't be part of this." With a final surge of strength, he pushed against the door, feeling the light envelop him. "We will not join you," he shouted, and with that, the door burst open, the light flooding the cavern. As the light engulfed them, Mark felt the darkness dissipating, the whispers fading into silence. They were pulled through the doorway, tumbling into the light as the shadows shrank away. Mark landed on the ground with a thud, the light blinding him momentarily. As his vision cleared, he realized they were no longer in the mountains. The air was fresh, the sun shining bright above them, casting a warm glow over the landscape. "Mark, Danny, are you okay?" Trent called, scrambling to his feet. "Yeah," Mark replied, breathless and disoriented. "What just happened?" "We escaped," Danny said, disbelief etched on his face as he looked around. "We actually made it." But as they stood up, Mark noticed something strange. The shadows they had fought so hard against were still lurking at the edges of the clearing, whispering softly, their presence haunting. "They're still here," he said, dread creeping back into his chest. "We have to stay vigilant." "Look," Trent pointed toward a distant ridge, where the mountains loomed ominously, their dark silhouettes contrasting sharply against the clear blue sky. "The mountains, they're still there." Mark felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the truth. The darkness may have retreated for now, but it had not been defeated. They had only escaped the immediate danger. "We need to warn others," Mark said, determination igniting within him. "We can't let this happen to anyone else." As they gathered themselves, the whispers echoed faintly in the distance, a reminder of the darkness that lurked just beyond their reach. They would carry the burden of knowledge with them, a warning of the evil that dwelled within the mountains. Together, they walked away from the clearing, the sun shining down on them, a beacon of hope in a world filled with darkness. They would fight back, stand united against the shadows, and ensure that no one else would fall victim to the malevolence that had claimed so many before. And as they made their way back to civilization, Mark felt a renewed sense of purpose. The mountains may have watched them, but they would not be powerless. They would become the guardians of the light, ready to face the darkness whenever it threatened to rise again.